Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, Shadowfax's reminder text showed him the meaning of haste. It's Matt Morgan.
So Joey, recently I learned that not knowing very much about Greek mythology really is my Achilles horse.
Oh, man. I see what you did there. You know, I always felt a really good connection with Achilles, because I too heels are hard, man. I can't walk around in heels.
Yeah, well, I mean, now that we're talking about it, I see that we've really opened up Pandora's labyrinth, and so we might need to move on, unless we don't waste too much time.
Yeah, your expertise in this subject matter is absolutely glowing.
It's really lacking. Really lacking.
All right. Up next, he's hoping that Old Man Willow encounters Magic's Autumn Willow. It's Dana Roach.
I had a rough week this week. I got rejected for a job at a sunscreen company of all places. I think I'm just going to reapply. But my face is so red about it, though. Just please don't rub it in.
Oh, wow.
I mean, Dana, don't get too invested. You really don't want to get burnt.
Fair.
Yeah. Oh, man. Okay, this is ludicrous. Fellas, what are we talking about on this episode today? Dana, what is this episode supposed to be about before we get too sidetracked?
Talk about drawing attention in EDH games by telling terrible jokes. Or whatever you do that may draw you attention in an EDH game.
I mean, this topic may pale in comparison to others we've done, but we're still pretty excited about it nonetheless.
Oh, no. Oh, this is about to be a good one. Okay, yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about, but we've got some shout-outs to do before we get into the meat of this episode. Dana, take it away.
First, I'd like to thank Chase, also known as Manicurves, for helping editing the show. You can find them on Twitter at Manicurves. And
if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking and subscribing this video on YouTube, subscribing on your local podcast app, or you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where for as little as $2 a month, you can get access to our Discord community, or for only $1 a month, you can be in the running for our weekly patron shoutout. And this week, that patron shoutout is going to go to Jeremy Jennings, hopefully no relation to Greg Jennings. Actually, that would be pretty cool, because Greg Jennings, Green Bay Packer, great, really. Dana, that's right up your alley. But since this is Magic the Gathering, Jeremy Jennings, thank you for all of your support.
I was more thinking in terms of Ken Jennings, all-time Jeopardy star, but either way, yes.
And current host.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay.
Beat out another Green Bay Packer, Aaron Rodgers, for that distinction. So there's a lot of Jenningses that are happening today. We just need to move on. But thank you, Jeremy, either way.
I'm happy to see that this is the type of trivia you do know a lot about. Greek mythology is clearly
right.
Not the strength, but this is a place where you've got quite a lot of prowess, and I'm proud of you, Matt. Good for you, man.
Yeah, I mean the ship of Odysseus and all those Theseuses and.
Okay, so Dana, let's get back on track. We're, as you said, talking about drawing attention in EDH games, and I think it's pretty obvious there are certain strategies that can draw a lot of attention, there are certain cards that can draw a lot of attention, and it's kind of a difficult thing to navigate. So how about you get us started on this subject? When you think about attention in EDH games and all that comes, with that territory, where is your first starting place? What's most on your mind?
So the first time I think I really became aware of this, many years ago, one of the first decks I had was a Talran Sky Summoner deck that I still have together. And I had a couple of different ways to kind of polymorph creatures in that deck. Because Talran makes so many, drakes that are relatively disposable, the thought process was, well, one of the strategies I can do is use some kind of a polymorph effect to trade the Drake off and then reveal cards from my library until I revealed whatever creature it was. And I only ran a handful of creatures in that deck. So I'm like, well, if I just put a couple of, strong creatures in here, I'm going to, whatever I polymorph will naturally be much better than that 2/2 Drake. And one of the things I had thrown in there was the original Jin-Gitaxias.
Yep.
And that's a crazy powerful card. And the amount of hate that generates when that hits the field is radically disproportionate to what I was able to do with that card. It literally, like, what I discovered very quickly after getting knocked out of games the couple times I got Jin out that way was I realized, my deck was stronger with weaker cards, with a weaker card. Like, something that flew under the radar that nobody really cared that came out was much better for me than it was flipping into Jin-Gitaxias, at least the way my deck was set up, because it wasn't designed to handle that level of animosity.
That story only makes sense if you're telling it when it happened in 2016, because there is no way in today's format, with just how much knowledge is going around about the format, that people aren't going to realize, like, oh man, Jin-Gitaxias, any version of it. There's like 7 versions of all the Praetors at this point too. And I think any version of a Praetor, if you, as soon as you see a Praetor hit the battlefield, no matter what it is, a ton of attention goes on there. Like, that might be the single most attention grabbing creature type in Magic lore at this point. But yeah, there's no way that one hits the battlefield. It just doesn't make a huge impact right away.
Yeah, very fair. And Dana, I learned a similar lesson when I was playing, me and my Reanimator stuff. But like, one of my favorite things to animate dead early on in my Commander career was definitely to revive that Jin to, I draw 7 extra cards and my opponents have to discard their hands. That sounds juicy and delicious. That also sounds like a nightmare for everybody. And frankly, they are right to have all of the attention in the room suddenly go straight onto that one card. And I am interested to delve a little bit deeper into the claim you made there that your deck was not basically it was not ready to handle all of that attention effectively, and that you might have actually had a better chance of succeeding in that game if you had played something that wasn't, stealing the spotlight from the rest of the table. And I do think there's some truth to that statement. It probably depends on maybe your level of preparation, but if you didn't realize just how much of a target you were about to draw on yourself, then having something that didn't spike out to the rest of the tables as a big, huge red flag probably could have served you in quite a lot of ways.
Yeah, and to kind of head off anyone who's yelling at their radio right now, listening to this in their car or whatever, we're not saying you shouldn't play really good cards.
Oh, yeah.
There's plenty of situations where you absolutely want to do that, but you should be playing them in a way that your deck is able to handle. And that deck, the way I had it built and the power level I tended to play at and the way my play style worked, that wasn't something I wanted to do. I didn't want to win the game with one card or immediately. And I also didn't want to lock people out by making them lose their hands. There was a bunch of reasons that didn't work for me. I'm not saying those things can't work for you. I'm not saying you shouldn't run absolute bombs that do draw that kind of attention. Because maybe that's fun for you. Maybe your deck is designed to play that way. But mine wasn't. And I think a lot of people's aren't. I've definitely seen plenty of situations where someone does drop that level of card, and you get that everyone immediately turns their attention to that person, and they aren't able to deal with it. They would have been better off playing something smaller that didn't draw that kind of attention than they were playing the bomb that got them knocked out of the game. So finding out what works for you and what doesn't, it's very much dependent on you and what you're looking to do. But I do think people definitely need to be aware that's a thing that absolutely happens.
Well, and not even that, just being able to have your deck be able to handle that kind of pressure, but because we've talked about that a couple of times in previous episodes, but mentally being prepared to have all the attention shift and to have the spotlight really turn onto you and your battlefield instantly. Those are the kind of cards that we're talking about where mentally, not just with what you have in the deck, but just in that game, you have to be prepared for, as soon as you play some of these cards that we're going to talk about, you're just going to be at the center of attention. And sometimes a lot of people, they kind of try to deflect and don't understand, well, why am I the enemy all of a sudden? Well, probably because you're playing a few of these cards that just tend to get a lot of attention.
And I think several of them are certainly justified. A Jin-Gitaxias, I see that and I'm okay. Or Matt, you see a Dictate of Erebus on the other side of the field, speaking of Greek mythology, and you're just whoa, I don't know anything about Greek mythology, but that makes me lose my creatures. And I need my creatures in play. So yeah, a lot of my attention is going to go onto that. How do I either deal with that enchantment or deal with that player? Because my whole game plan is now totally off kilter. I think if I see a Narset, Parter of Veils, which also stops me from drawing the cards, is not the kind of thing that I can just get away with ignoring. That one is clearly telegraphing that they're probably going to do a couple of wheel shenanigans. I really need to address this sooner than later, or else they're going to run away with the game.
And one shout out to the salt scores that we do. We've done them every single year. Really, if you just look at the top list of saltiest cards as far as cards that are going to get a bitter reaction from the rest of the pod, a lot of those cards, those are just going to get attention to you right away just because their reputation for doing things that are kind of unsavory for the social experience in a majority of circles, that's where you're going to get a lot of blowback on what you're putting in your cards. I know for me, cards like Consecrated Sphinx, if you play that, you best believe I'm turning everything towards you because I don't want you to draw 50 cards or do whatever you want. But yes, and Joey, you said Dictative Erebos. We don't say that in this household, but Dictative Erebos absolutely will get a lot of attention, especially from me or anybody else that likes to play creatures, because we play creatures to put them on the battlefield, not to let them die immediately. So Dictative Erebos absolutely keeping me from having those creatures. You're gonna get a lot of hate instantly from me.
Sure. Now, there's an interesting divide for me between some of those cards where I'm like, oh yeah, I see one of those and I'm like, I understand why there is this impulse, this immediate reaction where it's just like, I do have to make sure I deal with this. Doubling season. You know, you see a doubling season, that player could play a Planeswalker next turn and then suddenly they ult the Planeswalker, the entire game has shifted. So there are a whole bunch of cards like that definitely demand immediate attention. And when the board is full of a whole bunch of those types of cards, it's kind of like, okay, this is a whole lot to deal with. But I think there's kind of a divide between those examples and there are some cards that draw a lot of attention that I don't necessarily think always warrant the attention they draw. And maybe this sounds self-serving, but there are some times where I'm like, I don't think this is the biggest problem on the field. But you know what? When I cast that Mesmeric Orb, people don't like it. So that also draws a big amount of attention suddenly towards me, even if the way that card is milling isn't actually doing a whole lot to the board state compared to what some other players are up to. But like, it doesn't matter whether I think it should draw attention or not. The fact is that it does, and that is a thing I need to know when I go into EDH games and when I cast that card.
I mean, you stole Mesmeric Orb from my notes, Joey, because I definitely put it in there as far as cards that's so annoying. And one of those, we'd like to joke about one of the new player hurdles mentally getting over is, you know, paying 2 life to have a shock land come in and tapped isn't always a bad thing.
Right.
Kind of like it's not always a bad thing to mill over 2 cards, but it's that mental opportunity lost of, well, I could have drawn this card, but now I don't get to anymore, and I really would have liked it. It may not make a difference, but for some reason, that's a mental block I still can't get over, so I absolutely stand by Mesmeric Orb being one of those cards that I don't think it's necessarily bad for a lot of the decks that I play, but it's just frustrating to see all these good cards that I want to draw just go right into the graveyard without a chance for me to play them.
Oh man, what? No, I'm showing you your deck. Don't you like it? There's all of the cards in your deck.
I know what's in my deck. I don't need you to show me what's in my deck. I'm the one who put them there.
Well, and I think things like Mesmeric Orb also add this feeling that you're not in control of what's happening now. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I can't keep the things that are happening to my library beyond my ability to control them. And I think folks tend to find anything that makes them feel they're not in control of at least their own playfield and their own library in hand. I think that tends to be frustrating for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think Orb definitely kind of gives you that vibe where decision making is now out of your hands. And people, I think, tend to respond to that. Even if I tend to agree, Joey, it maybe isn't always, unless you're playing in a real specific deck, that amazingly powerful. It annoys people in a way that also like tends to draw ire.
No, that's a really, really good point. I mean, that's why, you know, the famous, like, a famous older version of Talrand was like, oops, all counter spells. Mm-hmm. And that also was the kind of thing that would be like, okay, like
right.
that could draw a certain type of attention from the table as well. Because it's like, I just want to resolve some spells, dang it.
Yep.
Or speaking of not having a lot of control, I think that sometimes that type of angst can also emerge when you encounter a wheels player across the table, because suddenly you're not getting to keep what you wanted in your hand, and it's hard to plan out your turn. And it's just like, everything keeps shifting and I don't feel like I'm doing the stuff that I wanted to. Mm-hmm. Even if the wheels player is not necessarily in that instance the most powerful player at the table, the fact that they're doing that and destabilizing what your intentions were for your turn is itself a factor that can sort of bias our threat perception during that game.
So one thing I like to think of in regards to creating these situations, if I'm the one creating them, there's an old, like, I'm not, first of all, preface by saying I'm not somebody who like spends a lot of time reflecting on the art of war and how I can apply it to everyday life.
Okay.
But there is I remember a quote from the Art of War about giving your opponent a golden bridge, I think is what it is. And basically the thought process there is, if your enemy is cornered and has no way to retreat, they will turn and fight to the death because they have no alternative. If you provide them some way out, that gives them a way to turn and run and number one, show you their back, but number two, like, flee the scene and give you the victory without forcing you to fight this bloody conflict of attrition. That does apply to Commander a little bit. If opponents have no way out, the graveyard player sees your rest in peace. Perhaps the way to deal with you if they're playing in black and can't remove it is to remove you. But something like a Soul Guide Lantern or a Scavenger Grounds, okay, well, that's going to stop them one time. But like in their head, they're like, okay, but I can maybe fight through that and come back. So I will deal with other things maybe versus removing the person. I think strategically speaking, it's very wise a lot of times to give your opponent that golden bridge. Let them see the way out versus the hard lock. And that's many cases going to keep them from resorting to player removal as the only solution. And I think that applies to a lot of these things.
Well, and you said it, Dana, but I know it's almost kind of a meme at this point, but the whole player removal is permanent removal. I think that still absolutely applies in a lot of pods that we just don't give credit to, or we just don't see those pods very often.
So I try to avoid putting myself in a position where someone looks at me and thinks, I need to remove that player. I don't want to be. I think it's strategically advantageous to not have folks look at your deck, at least where I play, the power level I play at. I think it's an advantage to have people look at me and not think that.
Yeah, I'm really all about that. That's a concept I'm going to turn over in my head a couple of times. I think that's very, very interesting. And it kind of goes back to the thing you were saying earlier, where sometimes having a thing that looks slightly less threatening, that isn't quite on the Jin-Gitaxias level, can actually benefit you because everyone else is taking up all of the attention. There is sometimes a caveat to some of those, I would say, where I do think that there's a lot of interesting stuff to go along with your earlier example of, like, if you have a different, big blue 8-drop or something instead of the Jin-Gitaxias that you're polymorphing into, that can be a thing that goes under the radar compared to what everyone else is doing. But sometimes those don't necessarily stack up. And more importantly, sometimes those things still get swept up in like a board wipe that someone else is using to deal with all of the threats at the same time. So I do think that those are interesting solutions, but I also understand why sometimes I don't necessarily want to play a thing that is a little bit less optimal, because I'm like, if a board wipe's going to happen anyway, I want it to be justified. I want them to actually have to take me down when I rise to this challenge, So it does get complicated, but I still like this idea that you're toying with of like, not quite as big of powerhouses that can actually give you other secret edges. Those are very important to pay attention to for sure.
So there's obviously, we talked about Praetors being super powerful and like, Blightsteel Colossus, no one wants to let a Blightsteel Colossus sit and play or whatever. But are there any specific strategies in like a general sense that tend to draw that kind of attention or ire from either of you two? Like, Matt, is there anything that when you see someone doing this thing that immediately makes you feel like I need to remove that player because I don't want to deal with this?
So I'm going to speak for everybody on the kind of the bottom half of the competitive spectrum, how casual or competitive we play. So anybody on the social spectrum is what we'll say. Any piece of stacks, any stacks deck in general, I get very suspicious of. Specifically for me in the way that I like to play, Ghostly Prison, Propaganda Effects, cards that make it hard for me to attack with all of the creatures that I do like to put on the battlefield. Those immediately for me are the cards that I don't like.
Are those stacks?
I think that they qualify in some level.
Stacks, there's a lot of overlap, I would say.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, you can't spell stacks without tack and attack, and
well,
you should show some tact and not play those cards is what I would say.
No, this is actually, I find this interesting. I think this could be a really interesting discussion.
Okay.
Like the actual, like, taxonomy of the term here is not interesting. Like, I kind of associate stacks to be like, oh, you can't untap, or I'm going to make you sacrifice all your stuff, like stasis and the winter orb and the smokestack and stuff like that. I don't usually associate it with like you have to pay extra to do the thing.
Sure.
I would call like a ghostly prison effect more of a pillow fort in my mind rather than stacks. But I also understand why emotionally you see that and you're just like, I can't hit you, and that's what my deck is designed to do. So it activates the frustrations. But an interesting thing is that I would propose, like, if you're playing a deck that draws a lot of attention, I would propose a ghostly prison or propaganda as a thing, as a solution, because you know that your deck draws a lot of attention, so you've got some of those defenses up. So it's interesting that for you, those are cards that actually draw a lot of your attention in and of themselves. That's actually fascinating to me.
So to me, a stacks card is anything that makes it hard or prevents you from doing something that's kind of integral to part of the game. Whether that's, it stops you from untapping, it stops you from casting spells. So you have cards like a knowledge pool or whatever. You have knowledge pool locks. So it prevents you from playing the game, from casting spells, etc. Ghostly prison, propaganda, and you're right, they probably do fall into more of a pillow fort in probably the general player's sense as far as their definition. But I still think that it's preventing or making it hard for you to do things, much the same way like you're taxing spells and making it cost more, etc. To me, really a stacks piece is anything that makes it difficult to take it part in any of the major phases on your turn.
So I understand Matt's emotional reaction to that. For me personally, I think things like propaganda, ghostly prison, and a lot of even tax effects those do qualify as kind of a golden bridge. Okay, ghostly prison's a pain in my butt. I can't solve this person's problem right now, but I can solve it in 2 turns maybe, right? Like I can draw a removal spell that will deal with that, versus like a smokestack or something is going to prevent me from playing, and it's going to cause problems that will cascade down throughout the turns. So for me, the like pillow fort kind of effects, or even a lot of tax effects, those qualify as a thing that doesn't generate a reaction for me necessarily, because I'm like, okay, that's something that I will deal with in a turn or 2 from now, versus something that I feel like is going to be a continuous issue.
So Dana, do you think that's more a severity thing then?
Yeah.
Smokestack obviously is probably one of the more egregious pieces of stacks in that category, because for those of you who haven't played against Smokestack, because I don't know if it's really even that popular anymore. I don't remember the last time I've seen it, but it's 4 mana for an artifact, and during your upkeep, you may put a soot counter on Smokestack, and during each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a permanent for each soot counter on Smokestack. So I'm sure there's a lot of decks out there that are built to abuse it. I mean, if you're making a lot of treasure tokens or any sort of just tokens in mass, it's pretty easy to just, okay, well, I'll go up to 5 soot counters, so everybody sacrifice 5 permanents, because I'm just going to sacrifice 5 food tokens, and it doesn't really matter.
And you can kind of dodge a little bit too, because you can stack those triggers, so you can do your sacrifice before the soot counter goes on it. No one else can do that. So it automatically also hits you less than it hits most people, and you can sacrifice the actual smokestack to itself if you need to at some point. So yeah, it is one of those cards that also makes it less destructive to the person who cast it. I mean, yeah, if I see someone cast a smokestack, I am going at them all the way. Whereas if I see someone cast a, ghostly prison, I will still strategically plan out when I can solve that problem that doesn't cause me to have that reaction that some other things do.
Yeah, very much. I think we all recently had an experience playing against a couple of decks where it involved a lot of pox effects, like Death Cloud, making everyone sacrifice X creatures, discard this many cards, losing a lot of lands. And it was just I don't know that that's necessarily the most powerful deck at the table, but I don't care.
Yeah.
And I think that there's probably an argument out there somewhere about you still should probably play to what is justifiably the most powerful thing at the table.
Sure.
But I also think that it's kind of okay to be you're killing all my stuff. That's gonna earn you some retaliation. That's a vibe that I'm actually okay with putting out into the game, because I'm hey, if you kill my stuff, that's gonna have a consequence. And I think that can also be a way of I don't think that's necessarily a strategic downgrade for me to act that way, because I don't want people to just feel like they can walk all over my battlefield, because I like my lands, dang it. So
well, and I also think there's some kind of in your head math you do where okay, well, maybe this person isn't a threat, but do I want this game to go an extra 20 minutes? Maybe I'll make the wrong choice and at least the game will be over. Like I tend to just swing wildly at chaos decks whenever I see a chaos deck. And absolutely my thought process there is, okay, even if it's a terrible choice and I lose, I would rather lose the game because of my terrible choices than spend an extra half hour in a game with a chaos deck.
But time equity absolutely is probably the most valuable resource outside of the game, because just the whole social aspect of the format depends on how much time do you want to invest in this game. Chaos decks tend to make the things elongate. It makes games go from an hour to 3. Time equity is probably the most important thing in my mind when it comes to your Commander games. Also probably the most important factor in when we challenge the stats, because we have to do it at a certain point in time. And I'm going to beat you to
I knew you were going to do that. I knew it was just like, he's going to use this time equity joke to be like, oh, it's also a good use of time is to segue. I was like, dang it. If you so much as had a pause in your breath there, I was going to jump right in.
I was running out of breath, but you know what? Kobe.
You got him.
Well done.
From downtown.
All right, yeah. Let's take a break from the conversation to challenge some of the statistics on EDHREC. We'll be right back after this quick break. All right, well, I am going to start us off this week with challenging the stats, and I want to take a suggestion from Rachel Weeks of Commander Sphere and Command Zone fame. Rachel actually tagged us a little bit ago about a card that she thinks is seeing a little bit too much play in Octavia Living Thesis, which is one of her absolute favorite decks. Octavia Living Thesis is a 10-mana 8/8 elemental octopus with Ward 8, and it costs less mana if you have a bunch of instants or sorceries in your graveyard, and it's got this cool Magecraft ability to turn other stuff into 8/8s. This is a signature deck of Rachel's, but she noticed a very interesting non-bow that can occur in this deck, and it's showing up a respectable amount in Octavia's data. Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, is a 5-mana 3/4 human wizard that shows up in about 28-29% of eligible Octavia decks. And Rachel's like, hey guys, I think I want to challenge the stats on this one, because Lier has this ability that can flash back your instants and sorceries, which is certainly pretty cool, although it does work a little bit against Octavia's thing of needing them in your graveyard. But more importantly, and this is the really big kicker here, Lier says spells can't be countered. And if your spells can't be countered, and if your opponent's spells can't be countered, then that Ward 8 ability that Octavia has, where you would counter spells that hit Octavia unless the opponent pays 8, it doesn't matter anymore. Using Lier in your Octavia deck actually just opens the door for Octavia to lose her inherent protective ability. And yeah, Rachel, I agree. That does kind of stink. A little bit of a non-bow going on there. So I would agree. I'd take another look at that 28-29% play rate there, and maybe find room for another card slot in your deck instead if you are playing Octavia, like Rachel Weeks loves to do. That's my challenge. Let's move it on.
So I have a challenge this week that was suggested to me, but just by a person I was playing in a pod with. And they were playing, I think it was an Anawan, the Ruin Thief deck, but that really wasn't relevant. The card is Insight. It's 2 and a blue. It's an enchantment. Whenever one of your opponents plays a green spell, you draw a card. It's currently in about 3,600 decks in EDHREC, and the person who dropped it on turn 3 mentioned that they put it in their deck because they were needing to substitute something in until they got a hold of Heuristic Study. Heuristic Study, also an enchantment, also draws you cards, also costs 3 mana, and it costs like almost $50 versus Insight that costs less than $1. And the player noted that while they were running Insight as their replacement for Heuristic Study, it drew almost as many cards as they were used to drawing with Heuristic Study. So when they finally got one, they just left Insight in alongside Heuristic Study. And it then proceeded to draw probably a dozen cards over the course of the next 3 turns, because 2 of the 3 people were playing green, and they were like not going to not cast green spells. And unlike Heuristic Study, you can't play around it either. So I'm not saying you should run Insight over Heuristic Study, but it's a ridiculously powerful card in a deck that wants Heuristic Study that costs less than $1 and generates a ton of card advantage. Only draws off green spells, but there's a lot of people playing a lot of green spells in Commander. So this definitely should be in more than 3,000 some decks. If you're looking for a budget replacement or just another Heuristic Study-esque effect, Give Insight a look. The card's fantastic.
I mean, turns out the Rhystic Study we have at home is still a pretty good card compared to a lot of
Pretty
other
good. Rhystic Study at home is still a pretty good Rhystic Study. Absolutely.
Well, I'll move on then. I'll wrap us up then with our listener-submitted challenge. So John Mullock sent us an email, which you can do, edhrecast@gmail.com, and had a really good challenge that I got a little, I kind of like that reaction when I first read it. So John sent us the email and says, love the podcast and your latest episode focused on a card that I think would be a good choice for challenge stats. Valakut Exploration isn't too terribly popular of a card, but I use it in my Gearson Starn Kellamorph deck to exile a card and deal 3 damage to the table every time I play a land. So, for those of you who don't know, Gearson Starn is the Izzet legendary creature from the Warhammer 40k precons, which is a 3/2, has Ward 2, but the important ability is whenever another source you control deals exactly 1 damage to a permanent or player, Gearson Starn Kellamorph deals 2 damage to that creature or player. So effectively turns 1 damage into 3. So Valakut Exploration going in there is one of my favorite enchantments. It's a card that I said a few episodes ago, I'm surprised it's not more popular. For 2 and a red, it's an enchantment that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. The important part with Gearson, though, is that at the beginning of your end step, if there are exiled cards with Valakut Exploration, put them into their owner's graveyard, then Valakut Exploration deals that much damage to each opponent. So, if you have 1 card exiled, and then you pass the turn, it goes to your graveyard, well, Gearson Starn just gets to bolt something for free. Well, that's just pretty good value in addition to, you have access to another card that you could be playing this turn. So, John goes on to say, I was surprised that it only shows up in 114 Gearson decks out of almost 6,300 decks, and it should be in a lot more. Well, I absolutely agree. Turning any land into a Valakut Molten Pinnacle because of Valakut Exploration, I think that's a pretty good trade-off. Gearson Starn likes dealing 1 damage, so if you ping it once, you're going to deal 3 damage. Just a nice source of just extra incremental, just accidental value, really. John, I really, really like this challenge. This is a great call. Any more excuses to play Valakut Exploration is okay with me, though.
Man, crack a fetch, and then you've got 2 of those things in exile, go to the end step, deal 6 damage to each person. That's gnarly. I'm all about that. Man, okay. So I want to move us back into our topic about having a whole bunch of you've stolen the spotlight with whatever strategy. And I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that it's not just the cards that are in your deck that like you play, one of them and then everyone's just like, oh, I got to deal with, Dana, you mentioned the Praetor example earlier. It's also fairly obvious that like the commander that you're choosing to play is going to draw quite a lot of attention to itself as well. Matt, I'm going to beat you to the punch. I know that you don't like Turgid. I know that if you see that one in the command zone, you already have your public enemy number 1, and it probably doesn't matter what else is happening in that game. And I think that that's also probably a thing that like none of us can escape from. We all have a version of that is just like, we all have a commander that needs to draw all of the, like it deserves the attention that it gets. For my own example, Sir Conrad, like Sir Conrad, every time I pull that one out, if he's in the command zone, yeah, that's going to draw a lot of attention my way. You kind of like, how often do you let me keep a Conrad in play? The answer is never. The answer is you don't let me do that. And the answer is also that if you are attacking me because of the commander I've chosen, you're probably right to do so. And I think that's a phenomenon worth getting into when it's the commander itself that is responsible for all of the spotlight, no matter what the rest of your game actions are.
Yeah, another category that I always give a side eye is the commanders that are kind of known as, and I'm going to use a term that our Commander Cookout friends use, the degenerate decks, as far as stuff that's kind of known for doing things that just, they're not fun or they may be one trick something. So like Beamtown Bullies is a commander that definitely falls in that category for me, where you kind of know what you're getting. They're going to cast Leveler, or they're going to put Leveler into their graveyard and then give it to you. Mm-hmm. Stuff like that, where you kind of just, oh, well, you got me. Yeah. Those are the types of commanders I also keep an eye out for.
Yeah, you gave me an Eater of Days, so now I have to skip 2 turns, and if that happens, I'm just kind of boned, and I'd rather know that ahead of time. I'd like seeing that in the command zone. I should be preparing for that as a thing rather than getting caught off guard by it. And Matt, I'll add an extra addendum onto that thing there. I think there are also those commanders out there where you're not sure whether they're going to do the thing that you just mentioned, like Kenrith the Returned King, for example. I can totally imagine going against a Kenrith deck where it's just like, oh yeah, no, this thing's tuned the house down boots. It is going to do some absolutely brutalizing stuff to this game. But also, I could go against a Kenrith deck where it's just like a person who did not know that Kenrith is so famous for being like a big combo engine, for example. And they just got a cool Kenrith deck, and it might be good, but it's like I don't want to necessarily bring all of that energy, my past experiences with like really tuned Kenriths, against a person who doesn't realize the reputation that their commander has brought with them, because not everyone knows the reputations that their commanders bring with them.
I'm with you there, Joey. A commander just being strong isn't necessarily enough to take my attention. Kenrith is a perfect example. Crazy powerful commander, and I'm obviously not going to let you just do whatever you want to do. That doesn't draw my attention the way that one of two other things do. Number one, a commander that feels like it's going to make it difficult for me to play the game. Turgid that got mentioned. Beantown Bullies is one that kind of tends to probably play that way as well. Baral, Chief of Compliance with 30 counter spells or something. So a commander that makes me feel like I'm not going to be able to play is going to draw my attention, and a commander that not just feels powerful but feels effortless in how it achieves that power. So maybe Kenrith is a very strong commander, but it never necessarily to me feels like it just does that accidentally, versus the Chulane is such an easy example to use. A person can go on a bathroom run and drop their hand haphazard on the table and maybe win a game in a Chulane deck with that. And that kind of thing is going to draw my attention, because I feel like I'm playing against a commander where I'm at a massive disadvantage just accidentally because of what's written on the card. So those are the two things that do draw my attention that way. Feeling like I'm not going to be able to play, and feeling like I'm at a massive disadvantage because of the words written on that card, and it requires little or no effort for the person to achieve that. Again, rightly or wrongly, maybe that's perception in some cases, but if I have that perception, it 100% draws my attention.
I mean, yeah, two of the biggest commanders that are like big red flags in the command zone for me are Zakama, and I'd probably also put Toxrill up there, because I know if their game plan is going to work, then it means I don't get to have stuff in play. There's a big difference between like an Underworld Dreams punishing me for drawing cards and a Narset that prevents me from drawing cards. In some ways, it's not even about however powerful their strategy is. It's actually just about how non-powerful I end up being as a result of it. Not being able to do the thing is a big emotional factor there.
So I guess my question is, how does that differ kind of from what your explanation just was, Dana? How does it differ from my kind of categorization of Ghostly Prison type of effects then? Because you said it's kind of my perception of not being able to participate in the game.
Sure.
I mean, for a majority of players, myself included, combat's really like a preferred way of winning, and that quite effectively stops our way from being able to participate and win the game.
For me, it's about inevitability. If like something feels inevitable, that generates that reaction from me. Chulane inevitably will create so much advantage I can't win that game, and that might be one turn. Whereas a Ghostly Prison doesn't feel inevitable. It feels like, oh, I can come up with a way to work my way through that. I can solve that problem in a way that I feel like if the Chulane player is allowed to play even a single turn of Magic, I probably can no longer solve that problem.
And for my part in this, I would say that, even if I can't attack through a whole bunch of those Pillow Fort effects, like it's impossible if the sphere of safeties and all of those are making it genuinely, it's too much mana to even try and break through. That still does feel emotionally different to me than a deck that has 10 board wipes that is preventing me from ever having stuff in play. At least in one of those cases, I do have some things in play, and even just the act of still being able to put cardboard onto the playmat can also still like be a feeling in and of itself that like I am still progressing something, and that does mean that I have an out. So it's more of like an aspect of hope is probably still emergent, but it also like, I do still have my own game plan, and hopefully my own game plan involves more than just the combat step, for instance. But the thing for me that I find most interesting are the ways that there's kind of a blurred line about some of these as well, because I think, for example, players who are used to Nyxor the Mind Razor, for example, are going to be very familiar with the play pattern of, oh, I can't keep this commander in play because of how much attention it draws when it's pinging everybody for all of the stuff that that they draw. And that has itself shaped the way that that deck tends to play. So instead of the potentially expected, I cast this commander and then it sits out, consecutively dealing damage, that kind of doesn't get to happen anymore. And yeah, that for me is the one of the most interesting bits about this phenomenon, is that when we know the stuff draws attention, it radically shapes our game plans about when we are going to actually deploy the commander and which cards we're going to use to support it. Like, some players might not cast the Mind Razor until such time that they actually have defenses or counterspells up to defend it, and they have a wheel in hand to make this immediately happen. Like, they're going to go off the turn that you see it, rather than your first impression of this commander where you expect it might sit and play for a little while, and that just doesn't happen. And that's kind of the, going back to my Conrad example.
Yeah.
I don't play Conrad until I'm ready to deal a whole bunch of damage, because you won't let it live.
Sure.
And that's an interesting way that the game plan has completely reshaped itself for that deck. And that affects a lot of the card choices that I have, because I can't put cards in the deck that are sitting there expecting me to have Conrad in play for a long time, because it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I've never seen you cast Conrad on curve.
Yeah.
But that's part of your game plan. You don't cast Conrad until you're ready to do at least one, maybe two things with it. And so just the timing of it takes it away. And so, yeah, we if you've ever watched us play on twitch.tv/EDHRECast, we always say and tell our guests, so as soon as Joey's Conrad hits the battlefield, you have to take care of it. And so I know Dana and we've kind of conditioned ourselves to play accordingly when we see you put that in the command zone. Mm-hmm. But then for everybody else that may not have had those experiences with you, it really does become a case of, I can't hold, or I can't waste any removal, because if Joey does play Conrad, the game's going to be over very quickly.
It can do some really gnarly stuff with a Mesmeric Orb, for example. That is a case where, yes, you should kill my Mesmeric Orb, or Tombstone Stairwell, or stuff like that. But yeah, usually when I play it, he's set to deal a whole bunch of stuff as soon as he arrives, because I've learned that I need to craft that game plan to be that way. But the other thing that I find interesting about this is that, counterintuitively, when I know that my commander draws a lot of attention, that actually sometimes makes me not play some of the more protective pieces. I've actually taken out Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, and Champion's Helm from my Conrad deck. And I initially had them in there because I was like, I need to protect Conrad. These will all give him Shroud or Hexproof or whatever, because people don't like Conrad. But the game plan that I have with this deck now is that as soon as he hits the field, that's when the stuff is about to happen, basically. So he's going to get removed in response to me trying to equip any of these Shroud givers to him anyway. So I don't need these, because I need to just go for it in general. And that's another fascinating piece to me, is that counterintuitively, the way I protect that commander has gotten less to do with the cards and a whole lot more to do with the social attention that I know he commands.
Okay, so Joe, you just talked about, that's a good example of a thing that you do, having realized that you have this deck and this commander that does draw attention. Is there anything that you would do, Matt, or that you've experienced? Do you have any commanders of yours that draw that level of attention, and what have you done, or what do you do when you are faced with that? Or even just a deck or strategy in general, when you become that person, how do you handle that?
Well, so for a little bit, my Riel the Everwise deck was very much that, because the whole deck kind of revolved around Riel's ability, where whenever I discard cards for the first time each turn, I draw that many cards. And so people kind of realized pretty quickly, oh, well, I gave you a turn and you really don't do anything if Riel's not around. So if I kill Riel, you don't do anything. But that's also kind of the downfall of a lot of the decks that I build, where my Raga Draga deck, for example, that definitely hinges on having my commander in play. So a lot of decks just in general that I build, I need to kind of wean myself off the reliance of having the commander in play. I've gotten a little bit better about that, but just in general, the timing doesn't really matter, because I can build up a board. Either I need my commander in play to make that board worth it, or the commander has to be in play for just anything to function. And so, yeah, I very much have to have that in the back of my mind when I'm building. And I also don't do a very good job at protecting my commanders. Be proud of me, both of you. I was updating my decks for the first time in 3 months.
Nice.
And I noticed, I kind of took out Swiftfoot Boots in pretty much every deck. I took out Lightning Greaves in a lot of my decks. I probably need to put those back in, because a lot of my decks just, they stop to function without that commander.
Dana, how about you? Once you have grabbed all of the, hogged all the spotlight, what do you do with all of that power?
So I tend to not run a ton of commanders that, at least on the surface, make it clear that you should stop them from being in play. So that tends to buy me time. But one of the things, like, I'm very intentional with cards that go in my deck. So I definitely am aware of what's powerful, and I am aware of the reaction. And I think through to myself, what is this going to look like? And is this worth me casting, or is it going to immediately get removed in a way that makes it not worth using? And the answer, it has to be something that I feel like it's worth my time to invest in that, and that I'm going to be able to get that advantage back out of it. So two examples that come to mind. I have a Dimir Dragon deck, Ancient Silver Dragon, big beefy dragon that you roll a d20 and draw that many cards when it swings in and hits somebody. No one wants that to do its thing. Similarly, Consecrated Sphinx in a Sphinx deck of mine. No one wants a Consecrated Sphinx to draw you a ton of cards. But those are both blue decks that have access to a significant amount of draw and have access to counter magic and are a little bit control-y. So I'm oftentimes able to put myself in a position that when I play them, I'm holding a Swan Song or an Arcane Denial so I can protect those creatures. Mm-hmm. And then once they do their thing, I'm able to protect them that much more. That Consecrated Sphinx, if I drop it and someone tries to remove it, I'm able to stop that from happening for a spinner on the board, in which case it's drawn me 6 or 8 cards. Ancient Silver Dragon, if I cast it and I'm able to, have a counterspell or 2 in hand and keep it alive till it comes back to me, which is what happened in a game I played earlier tonight, and then drew 17, then I'm definitely going to be able to protect it from that point on. So, like, I am very intentional about that. I look at the card and think, okay, if I'm going to play this, am I going to be able to keep it around for it to generate that kind of value? And how can I do that? And in decks where I can't, I tend to focus way more on cards that fly under the radar. And I wouldn't play, if there was a version of Ancient Silver Dragon or Consecrated Sphinx in a different, different colors or whatever, I perhaps wouldn't play them if I didn't feel like I could keep them safe. So I'm very intentional about those the bomb cards that do draw attention.
I think that's such an important lesson to keep in mind, that, like, especially knowing the way that you play. And yes, Dana, I've absolutely picked up on this, where I know that if Dana's deploying that, it's because he knows he's got the ability to actually secure it. He's not running that out willy-nilly. He's doing this man's got a plan. And that means that I need to meet him at that same energy if I'm going to stand any chance of actually dealing with what that plan is about to be. And that's just very, very important to keep in mind. And I mean, that kind of gets into another interesting thing that I think can also affect the spotlight, the grabbing all of the attention, is just, like, not even necessarily the reputation of the cards you play or the commander you're running, but, like, the player themselves. Am I wrong about that? Like, Matt, you were talking about this, phenomenon of your commander drawing a whole lot of attention and the deck falls apart without it. And sometimes a solution to that type of thing is to make sure that the rest of the deck can function a lot better without the commander needing to be in play. But sometimes when you do that, if you've loaded up the rest of the deck with a bunch of really big bad synergies, sometimes that means that you might wind up with a problem of the whole deck being the type of thing that draws a whole lot of attention at the games that you play, not just the commander. And then once again, you've stumbled into that, oh, now I have the reputation. Now I am the spotlight, regardless of the actions. And that can also be itself another interesting phenomenon to try and stumble through.
Yeah, well, and it's not to say that every single one of my decks doesn't function without the commander in play. I still have a couple decks that, whether it's my Selesnya decks that do all sorts of varied things. They benefit from the commander, but they don't rely on it. Having that array is still handy to have around. But yes, being able to kind of know and understand the weaknesses of your deck, and then how to not just get into a position of power, but like Dana was kind of hinting at, how to stay in the position of power. So once you get there, you're not going to let your grip go on control of the board state. That's something that I think a lot of players, they have in the back of their minds. I know what I want to do and how I want to become the big bad, but they don't know how to maintain that position and translate it into whether it's winning the game or doing the thing that they set out to do. So that is definitely a deck building exercise that I think a lot of players, myself definitely included, can benefit from, is trying to analyze, okay, so once I do the thing, how do I keep doing that thing?
Yeah, it's like the flavor text on Marchese's decree, right? Those who seize power must have the means to hold it. Timing matters a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in one final actually point I want to bring up here, because again, this is a thing that came up tonight in a game, and that's some things just don't draw attention in ways that maybe they should, and being aware of that is very useful. And I'll give you the example of that occurred in a game tonight. In a single turn, I cast Chart a Course, which draws you 2 cards, and I cast Winged Words, which draws you 2 cards. And because I made a token that turn, I then used Idol of Oblivion to tap to draw myself a card. So I drew 5 cards in a turn and passed my turn to the next player, and nobody really commented on that. The next player was a green player who cast, I believe it's the Garruk Primal Hunter, that you can down-tick him into basically kill Garruk, but draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. And that player drew 5 cards off that Garruk. That was that player's turn. And then and the other 2 people were like, "Oh, he just drew 5. We need to deal with that." And I'm like, "I just drew 5 too, guys. I didn't say that, but I literally drew the same amount of cards in my turn. But because I drew them in 3 small increments, nobody really paid attention to that or thought that through. Because that person drew 5 in a bulk, that did draw their attention." And I think that's definitely something that happens more often than we realize. Advantages that you accrue slowly tend to draw less attention from your opponents than advantages that you draw in a big flashy way.
Well, and Dana, that kind of reminds me of a card that I talked about a few weeks ago. Enchanter's Bane is a card that it doesn't do anything huge and splashy, but it does a bunch of little things just here and there. It pings Joey for 1 on one turn, then maybe 2 on the next turn. And then just as things kind of progress, it kind of scales well to what the game is doing. But it's never doing anything that just immediately grabs your attention and says, answer me. Mm-hmm. And that's there is a lot of benefit. And just having played against so many of your decks, Dana, they do that very, very well, where they're never doing anything that instantly jumps out at you, but it does so much at any given time that you're keeping up with the big splashy plays. You're just not getting any of the attention for it because you're spreading out that value. So instead of 1 big combo turn, you've been plotting your game 5 turns ahead of time.
And I'm not saying you shouldn't run Garruk Primal Hunter or Return of the Wild Speaker or Risk for Expertise. I love all of those cards. Risk for Expertise is Matt's favorite card of all time, or one of them. And
favorite card of all time.
I adore that card. But I'm also aware that the reaction that's going to cause from everyone else when I draw 6 and put a thing into play off that for free is different than the reaction I'm going to get when I do a Night's Whisper and then a Sign in Blood and then something else and draw basically the same amount of cards. But I've lost a little bit of life, and I've done it in a way that doesn't really seem that scary.
Yeah.
People do respond differently to those 2 things, and I'm. It's not maybe enough to make me not run those big splashy cards, but I'm very consciously aware of how people are going to perceive those things.
Can I? This is probably a silly example, but I think it totally works. The amount of attention that I get from my little Virtus guy who pokes you and cuts your life in half. That deck absolutely draws way more aggro to itself because it's annoying. It's so annoying. People do not want me to cut their life in half. But it is very, very funny to me, and this has absolutely happened. It is very funny to me that I will see more aggro come my way because I've got a Virtus in play than someone else who's got 30 damage currently on board. And I'm like, I get it. The emotional activation of having your life cut in half by this obnoxious little devil guy. Yes, it feels whoa. But the person who played a 5/5 and then another 5/5 and then another 5/5 and then another 5/5. We do need to address that because they're dealing more damage than me, and they built it a little bit more organically. It doesn't look quite as obnoxious, but that is a board that does need to be paid attention to a little bit more than just little old devil me.
Yeah, but in just how much you get in any given one turn, that definitely dictates kind of everybody's public perception of what you're doing. Whether it's Joey, you did 30 damage with 1 creature, and that's what gets all the attention. Not, well, I did 30 damage to Dana, but it took me 10 creatures. So you're right. Yes, public perception can change wildly, whether it's someone casting a Stinging Study and drawing 9 cards, or Dana drawing 9 cards because he had a Phyrexian Arena on the battlefield right away. So there's all sorts of different ways that you could spread out all the value, and I really like this approach that both of you have where you're not going for everything all at once. You're trying to spread out how you're getting all your resources because that's kind of delaying when the aggression comes towards you. That's just something that I've never been good at. I will just say that.
Well, Matt, speaking of things that we know you can get better at, there's that, and there's also, I guess, the Greek mythology from earlier is another takeaway that we learned. A little bit still some room for improvement.
I think a lot of room for improvement on both accounts, but I appreciate your vote of confidence.
Yeah, well, you do at least know the Lord of the Underworld in Greek mythology, right?
Erebos, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. I got nothing. That was perfect. Listeners, we would be very interested to hear from you about what you do when you've gotten a whole bunch of attention thrown onto you, and what are some strategies in the deck building process or in the gameplay process about how to deal with that. What is it that you do when it comes to taking the spotlight? It'd be very fascinating to hear from you. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Let us know in the comments. Leave a review. Do all of the amazing things. But for now, fellas, we are going to call this episode to a close. So let's go ahead and leave it off. Matt, where can folks find you online?
So you can find me on the Twitters at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, Wednesday evenings, we are streaming over at twitch.tv/EDHRECast. We have guests on every single week, and it's always a fun time. So tune in for that as well.
And Dana.
You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on the onlines, and you can find the cast at EDHRECast on Facebook and on Twitter and all of those places. And if you got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for assisting me with the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.